Namaskar. The study of Indian history. I am sure you have often asked yourself why you are studying history. Studying history is way of getting to know the past. History is an attempt to understand how and why our ancestors lived as they did, what difficulties they met with, and in what manner they overcame them. It is important for you to be acquainted with the past because then you will understand better what is happening in the India of today. You will come to know the story of your country, which started many centuries ago. You will come to know that the kings and statesmen who ruled and the people who made the story possible. You will also come to know why you are speaking the language which you speak. Apart from this, it is exciting to study the past. It is like playing a game of treasure hunt. There are clues hidden in all kinds of places, and when you find one clue, it leads you to the next, and slowly, step by step, you arrive at the treasure. In this case, the treasure is an understanding of what went on in the world and in our country long before you were born. The past of India is very long. It goes back several thousand years. We learn about how it about it from the evidence which our ancestors have left behind. For the near past, we have written and printed records of times when printing was not known. There are records written by hand on paper, but still earlier, even paper was not made, and records were written on dried palm leaves, the bark of birch tree, and plates of copper, and in some cases were inscribed on large rocks, pillars, stone walls, and tablets made of brick. There was a time when there was a time still further back when even writing was unknown. Our knowledge of the life of people in those ancient days comes from the objects which they left behind, as for example their pottery on the weapons and tools. These are things which are solid and which you can see and touch, and these have sometimes to be literally dug out of the earth. They are all clues. In the game of historical treasure hunt, clues can be of many kinds. The most commonly used are manuscripts. Manuscripts are ancient books written either on dried palm leaves the or the thin bark of the birch tree or on paper. Generally, the latter kind have survived, though books written on paper are not as solid as the others. Some of the languages in which the very old books are written are languages which we in India do not use in everyday life anymore, such as Pali and Prakrit. Others are written in Sanskrit and Arabic, which we still study and use in our religious ceremonies, although we do not speak them at home. Yet others are written in Tamil, a language which is spoken in South India and whose literature goes back to an early period. These are called classical languages, and the history of many parts of the world is recorded in various classical languages in Europe. Ancient manuscripts were often written in Greek and Latin. In Western Asia, they were written in Arabic and Hebrew, and in China, classical Chinese was used. The writing or the scripts in which the manuscripts of India are written resemble to the modern scripts. For example, you could probably read the script in which Sanskrit manuscripts are written, the Devanagari script, although you will not understand what was written until you learn Sanskrit, but the writing which was used 2000 years ago looks different, and in order to read that, you would have to be specially trained. This very ancient writing has not survived in many manuscripts, but largely in inscriptions. Writing which is engraved either on a stone surface or on metal or brick is called an inscription. Many such inscriptions have been found all over India in many languages. These are also clues in piecing together the past. Manuscripts are generally found in libraries, but inscriptions can be found on rocks, pillars, bricks, buildings, and metal plates. Much of the ancient history of India is based on the evidence which archaeology supplies. Archaeology means the study of the remains of the ancient past. This consists of monuments or buildings, coins, pottery, tools made of stone and metals, figures, images, and various other articles which people living many centuries ago had used in their daily life. Some of the very ancient towns and villages were either abandoned or destroyed, and their buildings were buried under the earth. They have to be dug out or excavated, but some buildings are still standing, such as temples, and do not have to be excavated. The clues provided by archaeology have enabled us to discover how men and women lived in India many thousand years ago. This type of life is described as primitive because of the people largely depended on nature for their livelihood. Their food was not cooked and their clothes were not sewn, and they had no houses. People living in this way are described as food gatherers. Slowly, as they learned more and more about the plants and animals which surrounded them, as they improved their tools and methods of making things, they began to lead an easier life. Finally, they found ways of growing plants and taming animals. This is the stage at which man is described as food producer. Soon these people were managing their lives so well that they were not only dwelling in comfort but had leisure hours to think and to record their thoughts and to improve their way of living. Early man is a nomad. It took many thousands of years for primitive man to change into civilized man. It took almost 3 lakh years for man to change from a food gatherer to a food producer. But once he had learned to be a food producer, he advanced very quickly. And the more control man has over his surroundings, the faster he progresses. To begin with, men were nomads. That is, they wandered in groups from place to place, mainly in search of food and shelter. The group usually consisted of a few men, women, and children who stayed together because it was safer to belong to a group rather than to wander about alone. Life was indeed very difficult in those days because people ate the fruit of the trees and hunted whatever animals they could. They did not know how to grow vegetables or grain. So when they had eaten all that they could find in a certain place, they had to move on to some other place in search of food. And similarly, when they had hunted most of the animals that they could find in one area, they had to go elsewhere in search of more animals. People lived in caves whenever they could find them, or else they built small shelters amidst the leafy branches of large trees. There were two things they were afraid of: the weather and wild animals. Early man could not understand what caused thunder or lightning, and when one does not understand the cause of a thing, one is frightened of it. Ferocious animals such as tigers, lions, panthers, elephants, and rhinoceros roamed in the forests, and India was covered with forests at that time. Man was weak in comparison with these animals and had to defeat himself either by hiding from them in caves and trees or by using his crude weapons. For many thousands of years of man's early history, we have no written records. The only remains which we can identify of this prehistoric period are the crude stone tools fashioned and used by men for hunting and other purposes. These tools are often found lying along the traces of rivers where ancient men used to roam about in search of wild game or in caves and rock shelters where he used to live. This stage when stone was the all-purpose material for man is called the Stone Age. For a considerably long time during this period, man remained essentially a food gatherer. He was almost totally dependent on nature for his food supply. The first tool made by him served many purposes such as skinning of dead animals, cutting their flesh and splitting bones, etc. He had to learn by experience how to chip stones correctly and to manufacture tools for specific needs. There are three distinct classes of tools representing correspondingly three different stages of man's progress through time. Early Stone Age tools: pebble tool used as a chopper made by chipping part of a pebble to produce a steep cutting edge. Hand axe: an all-purpose tool, generally pear-shaped with a continuous working edge on both sides. Cleaver showing a wide chisel edge. Middle Stone Age tools: border, arrowhead, scraper, etc. Late Stone Age tools: point. Late Stone Age tools: point, crescentic blade, scraper, etc. Some of these were used for killing fast-moving animals. This stage reflects a specialized and increasingly efficient food collection, leading to the appearance of the beginnings of plant cultivation against them and killing them. But the best means of defense against the animals was fire. At night, when everyone crowded into a cave, a fire was kept burning at the entrance, and this prevented the wild animals from entering the cave. In the cold of winter or on stormy nights, it was the fire against which acted as a source of comfort and protection. The discovery of the fire was accidental. The striking together of two pieces of flint produced a spark which, when it touched dry leaves and twigs, burst into a flame. Fire was a thing of wonder to primitive man, but later it came to be used in a variety of ways and contributed to many improvements in man's pattern of living. Thus, the discovery of fire made a significant difference to man and can be regarded as a major discovery. Tools and weapons: flint, which is a type of stone, was used for other things as well besides producing fire. Flint is hard, but it chips easily. Therefore, it is possible to shape it into various forms. Flint was used together with other types of stone for making tools and weapons. Some of these were found in the valley of the Sohan River in the Punjab. In some places, such as the Kashmir Valley, the bones of animals were also used. The larger pieces of stone of a size that can be held in a man's fist were shaped into hammers and choppers and axe heads. In the beginning, axe heads were used without a handle for cutting branches of trees, etc. Later, they were tied to a stick, which made it easier to use them. The use of tools gave man a big advantage. It enabled him to cut down trees, to kill animals, to dug the earth, and to shift wood and stone. The smaller pieces of stone, usually the chips and flakes from the larger pieces, were worked very carefully until there was a thin edge to the stone, and these pieces were then used as knives and scrapers for fine work, or were given a sharp point and tied to arrows and spears. Primitive man often lived by the side of a river or a stream in order to be near his water supply. If you walk along a riverbed in the foothills of the Himalayas or in certain parts of the Deccan Plateau, such as the Narmada Valley, and look carefully along the ground, you may find from time to time one of these stone to implements, as the archaeologists call them, clothes. Primitive man had little difficulty about clothes. When the weather was warm, little clothing was required. When it rained or the weather became cold, the skins of the animals which he had killed, as well as the bark of trees and large leaves, were used as clothes. A stiff skin or two wrapped around the body was enough to keep a man warm. History gives us knowledge of the past. It tells us what went on in the world and in our country long before we were born. Knowledge of the past improves our knowledge of the present. We learn of the past from tools, pottery, coins, old buildings, inscriptions, and old manuscripts. Manuscripts. Some of the buildings, tools, pots, and coins have to be dug out. Some of the language and scripts in which manuscripts and inscriptions were written are no longer used. In the beginning, man was a nomad. He lived in caves or on leafy branches of trees and ate fruits and fruit. In the course of time, he learned to make a fire and tools and weapons of stone. He hunted animals and ate their flesh, and in winter wrapped animal skins or leaves of trees round himself to keep warm. He wandered from place to place in groups. When he learned to make his own tools and weapons, so he took the first step towards civilization, beginnings of settled life. Gradually, as man's knowledge of his environment increased, there was a desire for a more comfortable way of living. A number of discoveries led to a change in the pattern of life. The most important of these was the discovery that man could grow plants and grains. He found that by putting seeds into the soil and watering the and watering the soil, sorry, and watering the soil. Sorry, and watering the soil. He found that by putting seeds into the soil and watering the soil, plants would grow. This was the beginning of agriculture. This was an important discovery because it meant that primitive man did not have to wander from place to place in search of food. He could grow his own food. He stopped being a nomad and began to settle down in one place as an agriculturist. These changes in man's pattern of life took place in various parts of India at various times, but in most places in our country, these changes took place about 4 to 5 thousand years ago. The taming of animals. Another exciting discovery was that some of the animals of the forest could be tamed. That is, man could tame them and use them for his own purpose. For example, wild goats could only be killed and their meat eaten, but tamed goats could provide milk every day and could be made to breed and provide more goats, some of which could be eaten without the need to go out hunting. The taming of the dog was a great help to man. Animals could also be used to draw the plow or the chart, and they helped man in this way. Discovery of metals. When primitive man began to settle down and grow his own food, he had first to clear a patch of ground by cutting down trees and shrubs. This is where two of the earlier discoveries came in very useful. Stone sorry, stone axes were used to cut down trees and shrubs, and later the stubble was burnt, so that finally the ground was clear and ready for cultivation. Cutting down trees with stone axes were a tiring job, but fortunately another discovery made it easier to fell trees. This was the discovery of metals, copper to begin with. It sorry Later, copper was mixed with other metals such as tin or even zinc and lead to make a new metal or alloy called bronze. How it all started, how a lump ore was melted and metal discovered, we do not know. Knives and axes made of metals were sharper and more efficient to use them than stone tools. The period when man used stone implements known is called the Stone Age or the Paleolithic and Neolithic Age, and the period when man began to use together with very tiny stone implements is called the Copper or Bronze Age or the Chalcolithic age. There are many places in India where copper or bronze axes and knives have been found. Brahmagiri near Mysore and Navda, Navda Toli on the Narmada are some of these places. The wheel, a very important discovery was that of the wheel. No one knows how discovered it or when or where, but it's and sorry but its tools and objects used by man in the food producing stage. The new the new Stone Age, Neolithic or the food producing stage was the time when man completely changed his way of life. Before this, man lived by hunting animals and collecting wild plants. In this new way of life, he began to domesticate animals and cultivate plants. The dog, goat, and sheep were probably the first of the animals to be domesticated. In among plants where wheat and barley were the earliest cereals grown. In order to do this, man had to settle down in certain selected areas. This led to the growth of villages and farming communities. He needed certain tools with which he could clear the land and others with which he could prepare the land for cultivation. He required vessels to store his surplus grains or to hold liquids. Thus, necessity led him to make certain earthen pots. The earliest pots were made by plastering clay round baskets. Later, they were made without using baskets. On the opposite page are shown some of the tools and objects used by men at the producing stage found at various sites in India. A weighted digging stick used for digging the ground. This tool consists of a stone mace head with a wooden stick sharpened to a point. A sickle used for harvesting. This tool was made from a series of small stone blades hafted in carved wooden stick and axe used for cutting and felling trees. This tool was made of hand stone chipped and ground to an edge, after which it was hafted to a wooden stick. A quern and mortar used for grinding gram. Various types of pottery. The base of one of the towels, one of the walls, sorry, various types of pottery. The base of one of the bowls shows marks of mat work. Discovery led to a big advance. Discovery led to a big advance in the pattern of living. Even to this day, the wheel is necessary, whether it be for something as tiny as the wristwatch or as large as the railway train. The invention of the wheel made life very much easier in a number of ways. For example, before the wheel came into use, a man has to walk or ride from sorry. For example, before the wheel came into use, a man had to walk or ride from place to place. Now he could make a cart which was drawn by an animal, and more people could travel easily from one place to another. The wheel also helped to move heavy objects which could not be moved before. In addition, the use of the wheel improved the making of pottery. The early villages, primitive men were now ready for more civilized living. The wandering groups now settled in one place, forming a village where they built huts for themselves, grew barley, rice, or wheat, and kept goats and other animals. These were the earliest villages or village communities. They were to be found all over India, but more often in river valleys and on the flat plains where the soil was more fertile and it was easier to grow crops. Archaeologists have found many remains of these villages, and from these sites called they are called we can describe the way in which primitive men lived. Sorry, the villages were small and the huts were close to each other. It was easier to defend the village from wild animals if everybody lived near each other. The area of the huts was probably surrounded either by a mud wall or by a fence of some prickly bush. The fields lay outside the fence. The village itself was usually built on slightly higher grounds than the fields. The huts were thatched and ordinarily consisted of just one room. Poles were used to form a frame to which were attached branches and thatch. A fire was lit in the hut on which the cooking was done and round which the family slept at night. Food was now cooked and not eaten raw. Meat was roasted over the fire. Grain was ground between two stones and the flour was made into bread. The extra grain was stored in large jars. Cooking required vessels in which to cook the food. These were made of clay pottery in earlier times and later of metal in the beginning. Clay pots were made by women who shaped the clay by hand into forms resembling round jars and bowls and plates, and these were dried in the sun. Later, the dry clay vessels were baked in a kiln which made them so hard and fat that they did not dissolve when put into water. Still later, when the vessel came into use, it was quicker to make the pots on the wheel. These were made in same way as our pots were made in the villages today. The Chalcolithic potter sometimes decorated his pots with beautiful designs, dress and ornaments. Chalcolithic men were fond of ornaments and decoration. Life was no longer a grim fight against wild animals and bad weather, he had an he had time to enjoy himself and made ornaments for himself and for the women. The women wore ornaments of shell and bone and carried finely worked combs in their hair. Animal Animal, sorry, animal skins, bark, and leaves were no longer the only form of clothing. Man had invented the technique of spinning and weaving cloth from the fluff- fluffy substance of the cotton plant. Leisure hours were given to fun and amusement. Society. When man started living in village communities and ceased to be a nomad, he could no longer do just as he pleased, and it because necessary to make rules of conduct. Living with other families and other groups meant that there had to be some law and order in the village. The first thing was to decide what each person's job was to be. Some of the men went to work in the fields, while others looked after the animals or built the huts and made the tools and weapons. Some of the women had to spin and weave cloth, and others make pottery or cook the food or look after the children. The decision was as to who should do what was taken by the village as a whole. All the same, there had to be a leader in the village, a man who could give commands. Generally, the leader was the oldest man who was also believed to be the wisest, but sometimes it was the strongest and bravest man. Religion. There were certain aspects of life which puzzled man. Why did the sun rise every morning and set every evening? Sleep and dreams, birth, growth, and death were puzzling. How was it that year after year the same positions kept returning? What happened to a man when he died? Men were afraid of death. They were also afraid of thunder and earthquakes. because they did not know what caused them. Some men gave more thought than others to these questions and suggested answers. There was a sky god who allowed the sun to travel across the sky each day. The earth was like a mother feeding her children with crops and plants, and if the sun was to rise each morning and the earth to bear crops, then the sky god and the earth goddess must be worshipped with sacrifices and hymns. Small clay images were also made of the earth goddess in the form of a mother, and these were widely worshipped. Some of the men became magic men who claimed they could control the weather and cure illness and prevent the people from being harmed. Later, there arose a group of priests who performed the sacrifices and sang the hymns on behalf of the whole community. Death was a journey into another world from which no one ever returned. So, when a man or a woman died, he or she was buried in a grave, or if a child died, it was placed in a large pot or urn and then buried in a grave. The grave was sometimes lined with large slabs of stone, along with the body, pots and beads and anything else which the village believed the dead person could require on his journey were placed in the grave. The culture of man or the pattern of living or the clay of har- mm, be having had advanced considerably from the primitive stage when man was a nomad gathering food and living from day to day. Now he had a regular place to live in and was fairly secure in his village. He was making improvements in his view of life and was discovering new methods of doing things, methods which made his life more comfortable and easy. But there are still one thing which he lacked and which prevented him from advancing more quickly. He did not know how to write. He could teach his children how to grow crop and look after animals or make pots, but he could not write down his knowledge. The knowledge of writing was to come at a later stage when cities came into existence. The primitive, the primitive man was on the way to a civilized life when he had discovered how to make a fire and tools from pieces of flint, and when he began to tame animals. Soon he learned to grow grain. He also discovered metals. These discoveries were important. He stopped wandering, settled at one place, and began to grow his food, make huts for shelter, and use new tools and, and implements. The discovery of the wheel was a great help to early men. He could move from place to place more easily. He could also make better pottery. He made ornaments and learned to make clothes. In the village, he felt the need for organized life. Thus, the nomads turned into a community with a fair amount of organization and division of work. They began to worship the sky and the sun and also the earth that provided food for them. Though man had progressed and he did not yet know the art of writing, man takes to city life. The cities over the years, some of the smaller villages grew into larger ones. The number of people living in them increased. New needs arose and new occupations were started. People in these large villages were prosperous because they were now producing more food than they required for their needs, so they could exchange this surplus food for other things such as clothes, pottery, or ornaments. Now it was no longer necessary for every family to work in the fields and produce his own food. Those who were weavers, potters, and carpenters exchanged the articles with which they produced for food grown by other families. Gradually, as trade increased, Craft, sorry, the craftsmen began to live together in such Villages grew into towns. The beginning of city life introduced an advance in technology and a higher degree of civilization. Civilization as is that stage of man's development when he looks for more than just the satisfaction of his material needs. He has enough food so that he can live in cities. He trades his produce with others. He has leisure to think and to seek answers from the many questions which puzzle him about life. He has knowledge of writing so that he can record his thoughts. His community is governed by laws. Man is civilized when he attempts to satisfy the need of his mind. The houses in the cities were built of brick. The roads were carefully laid out, and cleanliness in the city was maintained by efficiently kept trains to clear away the waste. Communications were improved and trade increased. Social life was no longer simple. Rules of various kinds became necessary, as also a government to administer them. But the biggest advance was the invention of a script, which, to start with, was used by the traders to keep a record of their trade. The earliest city to be discovered in India was Mohenjo-daro on the river Indus in Sindh. Further up the Indus Valley, another ancient city was excavated, and this was Harappa near modern Montgomery. The archaeologists called the civilization of these ancient cities the Indus Valley civilization because these cities and other sites sharing the same culture were found in the Indus Valley. But for the last 20 years, archaeologists have been digging in the other parts of northern and western India and have found more cities which resemble those of the Indus Valley. There were sorry, Therefore, the Indus Valley civilization is now also called the Harappa culture, since the pattern of living in these resembles that of Harappa. One of these cities were found at Rupar near Chandigarh, another at Lothal near Ahmedabad, and a third at Kalibangan in Rajasthan. The Harappa culture was spread over the whole of Sindh, Balochistan, almost the whole of the Punjab, east and west North Rajasthan, Kathiawar, and Gujarat. If you locate these areas on a map, you will see how large the geographical extent of the culture was. It was called a civilization because the people were living a more advanced life than those of the previous primitive ages. In the cities were also planned, and great care were taken to look after them pros- properly. People were prosperous and had leisure for both amusement and contemplation. Harappa people knew how to write, and their language was written in picture-like signs. The people were prosperous. Sorry, the people were prosperous and had leisure for both amusement and contemplation. The Harappa people knew how to write, and their language was written in picture-like signs called the pictographs. So, unfortunately, unfortunately historians have not yet been able to read and understand these pictographs. The Harappa culture grew and developed in India at the same time as other civilizations in the other parts of Asia and Africa, mainly in the valley of the river Nile, Euphrates, Tigris, Wangho. The Harappa culture became potent about 4,500 years ago, or as people now normally say, in 2,500 BC before Christ. In Egypt, there was the civilization of the pharaohs who built the pyramids at that time in the region now called the Iraq. There was the Sumerian civilization. The Harappa people had trading contacts with the people of Sumer. Even in those days, there was trade between India and other parts of the world. The environment at that time, the northern and western parts of India, including what was now Pakistan, were discovered with forests. The climate was moist and humid, and Sindh and Rajasthan were not desert area as they are today. The animals which the people of this region knew were forest animals such as the tiger and the elephant and the rhinoceros and the hippopotamus. The forests provided timber which was used in the kilns where the bricks used for building the cities were made. Timber was also used for building boats. The banks of the rivers were lined with fats. It was easy to cultivate the soil because the rivers flooded the land regularly every year, so the seed was put into the soil just before the flood, and the coming of the flood watered the fields. People had to build embankments, dams, and channels to direct the flow of water, but complicated irrigation was not. But sorry, people people had to build embankments. People had to build embankments, dams, and channels to direct the flow of water from a complicated irrigation was not necessary. More grains was grown than was actually eaten by the people in the villages. This extra or surplus grain was taken to the cities to feed the people of the towns and was stored in large granaries or buildings especially made for storing grains. The people living in the cities did not cultivate the fields. They were mainly craftsmen and traders who was sorry who earned their living by producing and exchanging various articles. They made articles by hand such as beads, clothes, and ornaments which were used in the cities, and some of which were also went to distant lands. As for example, the kingdom of Sumer in Iraq, cities and their buildings. The cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were divided into two parts. The upper part, built on raised ground, has been described as the citadel. This part included the public buildings, the granaries, the more important factors, and the more important factors and the religious buildings. Sorry, the other parts of the city, which was much larger, was the lower part where the people lived and carried on their professional work. If the city was attacked or threatened by floods, the inhabitants of the lower city probably found refuge in the citadel. In the citadel at Harappa, the most impressive building was the granary. They were neatly laid out in rectangles and lay close to the river. The grain was brought in boats along the river and stored in the granary. This was the best way of transporting grain, as it was the cheapest and most efficient way. Since it required less labor, the granaries were important because the life of the city dwellers depended on the granaries being full. Near the granaries were the furnaces where the metal workers produced a variety of objects in metals such as copper, bronze, lead, and tin. The porters also worked in this part, and the laborers all lived together near the factory in small quarters. The citadel at Mohenjo-daro, protected by a rampart, had there and other buildings as well. There is a large building which appears to have been a place or house of a governor, though are not certain whether the Harappa people had a king or whether they were ruled by a committee of citizens. Another building nearby was either a building meeting hall or a marketplace. The best none of the buildings in the Mohenjo-daro citadel, the Great Bath. This resembles a large swimming pool, but its purpose is not known to us. The house in the lower city of Mohenjo-daro was carefully planned before the houses were built. The streets ran straight at and at right angles to each other. Streets were right. The main street being about 10 meters wide, which is as wide as many of the large streets in modern cities. The houses were built on both sides of the street. Houses were built of brick and many and had thick, strong walls which were plastered and colored. The roofs were flat. There were few windows, which but plenty of doors, which were probably made of wood. The kitchen had a fireplace and a large jars of pottery for storing grain or oil. Adjacent to it was the drain. Bathrooms were built on one side of the house and had drains which were connected with the street chain. The street drain ran along the sides of the street and was linked with bricks so that it could be kept clean. Some of the drains were covered with slabs of stone. In the house there was a courtyard which had an oven for baked bread, and the housewife had sat here to grind her spices with a pestle and mortar. Perhaps the domestic animals such as the dogs and goats were also kept in the courtyard. Some houses had their own wells, which meant their water was always available inside the house. Not everyone in the city lived in such comfortable houses. The laborers who worked in the granaries and kilns had each a tiny rooms to live in and were probably very poor. A new stage in civilization was reached with the growth of cities in India. With the excavation of two ancient cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, a highly developed ancient civilization of 5,000 years ago was laid bare. Recently, several more cities with a small similar way of life as in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro have been excavated at Rupar, Lothal, and Kalibangan. This civilization is known as the Indus Valley Civilization or the Harappa culture. It extended over a vast area including Sindh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Kathiawar, and Gujarat. From the excavations, we know that this was a highly developed civilization. The cities were well planned and probably looked after. The streets were well laid out and had an efficient drainage system. The houses were well planned. The people of this civilization had developed contacts with the people of other civilizations of that time in the West Asia. The life of the people, food. The people who ate wheat and barley, which they ground in my millstones and baked into bread. They liked fruit, particularly pomegranates and bananas. They also ate meat and fish. Clothes. They knew how to wear cotton, and the findings of clay spindles suggest suggests that many of the women must have spun the yarn at home. The women wore a short skirt which were held at their waist by a girdle. The men wrapped long pieces of cloth around themselves. The clothes were of cotton, though some wool was also used. The women enjoyed dressing their hair in various ways, which they then decorated with combs. Both men and women were fond of wearing ornaments. The men wore amulets and the women wore bracelets and necklaces. These were made of bits of shell and for the rich of gold and silver. Amusements and toys. Some objects have been found which provide clues to the amusements of the Harappa people. For the children, there were toys, small clay carts resembling the modern cars, which were probably copies of the cards drawn by auction in which the grown-ups traveled figures of animals which were made like puppets so that their limbs could be moved by pulling a string. Whistles made in the form of birds and rattles of all kinds. Marbles were also popular with children. For girls, there were dolls too, The other people spent their time in gambling, dancing, hunting, and cockfighting occupations. The spinning and weaving of cotton and wool must have kept a large number of people. BJP people, cloth was used by the Harappans and was also sent to the towns along the coast of the Persian Gulf and to Sumer. The potters were probably kept the busiest of all, and they produced some beautiful pottery. Most of it was made of a reddish clay, and on it was painted designs in black lines, dots, geometrical designs, trees, and leaf designs and animal figures. The making of beads and amulets was also popular. These have been found in large numbers. Beads were made of clay, stone, paste, shell, and ivory. The metal workers produced tools and implements in copper and bronze such as spears, knives, arrows, heads, axes, fish hooks and razors. Vessels used in the house were also made of thin metal sheets resembling the pottery vessel, but these must have been expensive and therefore used only by the rich. Among the objects found in great numbers at Mohenjo-daro were flat rectangular seals made of clay or stone. The seal has a design on one side, usually the piece of a bull or a tree. Usually the piece of a bull or a tree or some scene and above the picture as is a line of pictographs. The picture signs used as a script by the Harappa people. These seals were perhaps used by merchants and traders to stamp their goods. Trade. There was at that this time contact between the people of Sumer and of the towns lying along the Persian Gulf and the Harappan people. They traded with each other and sent goods regularly from one place to another. Seals and small objects made at Mohenjo-daro have been found at Babylon. The merchandise was shipped from Lothal, where a dock has been excavated and incoming goods were received. The here weights and measures naturally played an important part in the merchant's life, and these have been found in various shapes and very accurately graded religion. Unlike the people of the Egypt and Sumer, the Harappans have not left any inscriptions describing their government, their society, and their religion. We can only guess at what their religion may have been. Clay figures of mother goddesses have been found, so they probably worshipped these. A seated figure of a male god carved on a small stone seal was found. There were certain trees which they seem to have treated as sacred, such as the peepal tree, which is often shown on the seals. They might also have been might also have held the wood sacred. The Harappans buried their dead in graves. They must have believed that there was life somewhere even after death, because the graves often contained houses, household pottery, ornaments, and mirrors which have belonged to the dead person and which it was thought he or she might need after death. The fall of the Harappans. The Harappa culture lasted for about 1,000 years. By 1500 BC, when the Padians began to arrive in India, the Harappa culture had collapsed. Why did this happen? Cities may have been destroyed by floods, which came regularly, and there may have been an epidemic or some terrible disease which killed the people. The climate also began to change, and the region became more and more dry and like a desert, or else the cities may have been attacked or were unable to defend themselves. The fall of the Harappa culture was a sad event in the history of India. The Aryans who came afterwards knew nothing of city life. So it took another 1,000 years after the coming of the Aryans before India could again boast of beautiful cities. The articles have been found in the various cities of the Harappa culture shows that the people in those days led a fairly advanced life. They were they were good builders, skillful craftsmen, and manufacturers, clever clever farmers, and big traders. They manufactured cotton and wood cloth. They were fond of ornaments. Their pottery was beautiful. They traded with the people of Sumer. They used precise weights and measures and perhaps marked their goods with seals. They knew how to write, but their writing has not been read so far. Sorry, they used precise weights and measures and perhaps marked their goods and seals with seals. They knew how to write, but their writing has not been read so far. They seemed to have worshipped the mother goddess and held the people tree and the bull sacred. They had many types of amusements and children had their joy. The fall of the Harappa culture was a sad event because the culture which followed was not as advanced as that of the Harappa people. Life in the Vedic age, the Aryan settlements. Until the discovery of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, it was thought that Indian history began with the coming of Aryans, but now we know that it is much older. The Aryans came from outside India, from sorry, from North India, Iran, and region around the Caspian Sea. Those that came to India are called the Indo-Aryans to distinguish them from the other Aryans who went to various parts of Western Asia and Europe. The Aryans at first settled in the Punjab. Gradually, they moved southwards into the region just north of Delhi. They used to be a river. There used to be a river flowing nearby called Saraswati, but there used to be a river flowing nearby called Saraswati, but the water of this river has now dried up here. Has now dried up here. They remained for many years, and here they prepared for the collection of hymns known as the Veda. In the same region is the plain of Kurukshetra, where it is believed the great battle between the Pandavas and the Kauravas was fought. Sometimes later, the Aryans moved still further eastwards into the Ganga Valley and cleared the thick forests as they went along with their newly discovered iron axes. Since they had discovered the use of iron and had begun to make tools and weapons of iron. These in turn made it easier for them to clear the land. The Aryans came as pastoral nomads, that is, they kept large herds of cattle, which was their means of livelihood, and they wandered from place to place. Gradually, they took to agriculture and began to settle down permanently in villages because they were nomads. They were unfamiliar with the city life, and it took a few centuries for the Aryans to begin building cities. Their early habitation sites, therefore, are villages. Our knowledge of the Aryans is not best as it is in the case of Harappan people, mostly on digging up their habitation sites. We know about the Aryans from the hymns in the poems and stories which they composed and which were recited and passed on from generation to generation until they were finally written down. We call this literary evidence and it provides a clues to their history. But recently, digging in certain places such as Hastinapur and Atranji Khera in western Uttar Pradesh has also supplied further information about their culture. The hymns were composed in praise of the god whom they worshipped. Rules were made about their religious ceremonies, their work, and worship. They can be found The four Vedas, Ring Veda, Sham Veda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda. They also wrote long poems about their kingdoms, kings and heroes, about their bravery and the battles which they fought. These poems were later collected and because the two epics of ancient India, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The king and his officers, the Aryans, were divided into tribes, and each tribe settled in a particular region. But the tribes were often fighting each other. The herds of animals required grasslands for grazing, and the tribes fought over the possessions of these grasslands. Each tribe had its king or chief, who was generally selected for his strength and bravery. Later, kingship became hereditary, that is, the son of a king became the king when his father died. The king's duty was to protect the tribe, and he had a group of warriors to help him in this. The king ruled according to the wishes of the tribe, and he had various officers to assist him. There was the commander of his warriors, the Senani, who was always with him. There was a priest or Purohit who prepared the religious ceremonies for him and advised him. Were there were messengers through whom he made contact with his tribesmen living in neighboring villages. The king also consulted the headmen of the villages of his tribe, the Jagramins. But if there was something very important to be discovered, then the king took the advice of the entire tribe. These assemblies as were called the Samiti and the Sabha. In the Samiti, anyone could speak about his mind about the problem, but the Sabha appears to have been some smaller assembly of selected people. The tribe was split into small units called the grams, comprising a number of families living in cities. The tribe was split into small units called grams, comprising a number of families living in villages. The Aryans later gave up on the nomadic way of life and took to agriculture. Then the villages became larger, and many more numbers of tribe lived in one village. A group of villages was known as a vish. The people of the tribe was called Jana. The people of the tribe was called Jana. The village was divided into families and all the members of a family lived together in a joint household. The family was a patriarchy family, that is, the oldest male member in the family was regarded as the head of the family. Often, this was the grandfather. This was a position of power in the family, since the head man made all the decisions and the other members tried to accept whatever he decided. The sons brought their wives home and continued to live with their father. Women were held in sorry women were held in respect. Some of the girls were educated along the boys. Sorry, some of the girls were educated along with the boys. When the Aryans had settled down in village communities, the life of the village included more persons than merely those who cultivated the fields. There were craftsmen as well, and certain villages began to specialize in particular crafts. For instance, in areas where the clay was good for making pots. There were many potter's surplus pots made in one village were sent to a neighboring village where there may not have been enough pots. Thus, trading began with goods being exchanged and transported from one village to another. But all this was still a very small, very simple level. The village consisted. But all this was still a very simple but all this was still at a very simple level. The villages consisted of a group of thatched in huts surrounded by a fence with the fields lying outside the fence. Fields were plowed and were irrigated with water from wells or channels. This was different from the method of cultivation of the Harappa people. Barley was widely grown and later on they also grew wheat and rice. Hunting was another common occupation with elephants, buffaloes, antelopes and boars being the object of the hunt. Bulls and oxen were used for plowing. The cow had pride of place among the animals because the Aryans were dependent on the produce of the cow. In fact, for special guests, beef was served as a mark of honor. A man's life was valued as equal to that of 100 cows. If a man killed another man, he had to give 1,000 cows. 100,000 give 1,000 cows to the family of the dead man as a punishment. The Aryan and his horse. The Aryans had a genuine love for horses. They had brought horses with them from Iran. Horses were used. The horses was used by largely. The horses was used largely for drawing chariots. One of the favorite amusements of the Aryans was chariot racing. And the chariot maker was a respected member of the community. The chariot has been described often in the Hymen. It was a light two-wheeled chariot which was exciting to race and was useful in battle. The Aryans came to India from northeastern India and the region around the Caspian Sea. At first they settled in the Punjab and then some of them moved southeastwards into the region north of Delhi. Their further eastward expansion into the Ganga Valley was made easier by the discovery of the use of iron. Our knowledge of the Aryans is based on literary evidence, hymns, poems, and stories which they composed. Aryan society was divided into tribes headed by chiefs or kings, though through the Samiti and the Sabha, the king consulted the members of the tribe. The tribe was split into small units comprising a number of families living in villages. The Aryan family was a patriarchy family. When the Aryans came into India, they were a nomadic people. After they took to agriculture and settled in villages, some of them began to specialize in certain crafts. This led to the exchange of goods between one village and another. The Aryans used horses which they had brought from Iran for drawing chariots. Life of the people, the Aryans in the thus used. When the Aryans first arrived in India, they had to fight for land with the people already living in India. These people they called the Suj or the Sas. The Aryans were feared. Sorry, these people they called the Suj or the Sas. The Aryans were feared skinned, and the Suj were described as being dark skinned with flat noses. The Suj did not worship the same god outside the Aryans. They spoke a language the audience did not understand because the latter spoke Sanskrit. The audience who fought and defeated the other Sioux did not treat them kindly and enslaved many of them. The Sioux had to work for the audience and were made to do the most difficult and lowly work. The audience made it rule that no Aryan could marry the society, the audience and the Sioux lived in separate parts of the same village, and in the beginning, they were not allowed to mix with one another. The audience were also divided amongst themselves into three classes. The most powerful people were the king and his warriors, who were called Kshatriyas. Was the sorry, equally impo- sorry Equally important were the priests or Brahmins, and they came the craftsmen, and then came the craftsmen and cultivators or Vaishyas. There was, in addition, a fourth group called the Shudra. This consisted of the Siouxes and those Aryans who had mixed with the Sioux and married the Sioux. So they were looked down upon. Thus, Aryan society was divided into four groups or castes: Kshatriya, Brahmins, Vaishyas, and Shudras. And each group had separate occupations and activity in society. To begin with, the boy could choose whatever occupation he wished. Usually, sons begin to do the same work as their fathers. The Brahmins began by being equal in importance with the Kshatriyas, but slowly they became so influential that they were given the first position. They they did by making religion very important. Occupations apart from agriculture, cattle rearing, fishing, metal work, carpentry, tanning were common occupations in the villages. Metal workers now had a new metal with which to work iron. The use of iron made life easier for the Aryans. Iron, being a hard, tough metal, was better suited for copper or bronze for making tools and weapons. Weaving and spinning of cloth continued, with women doing much of it. The priests were kept quiet with performing religious ceremonies, especially the big sacrifices in which the entire tribe took part and which lasted for many days. The priests were also the Thatchers. Young boys stayed with the priests who taught them how to recite the hymns of the Vedas. This is an amusing description of the pupils in one of the hymns. It is said that the pupils repeating the lesson after the teacher sound like frogs croaking before the coming of the rains. The priests were also the doctors in the village. They knew how about the herbs and plants, and when someone fell ill, the priest was called to give medicine to the sick man. The dress worn by the guardians was not very different from that of the Harappa people. It consisted of two pieces of cloth, the thariya or upper and the antariya or lower. A garment which reached down to the anklet and a turban to tie around the head were also in Use. Were fond of ornaments. These were made of gold or other metals, and the women wore beads in various fashions. The rich people wore cloth which was embroidered with gold thread amusements. The sorry, the chariot racing was much in favor among the Aryans. They also entertained themselves with the dancing and music. For music, they used the flute and lute, which resembled the veena and the drums. But their favorite pastime appears to have been gambling. Food. The Aryans drank a great deal of milk and ate plenty of butter and ghee, fruit, vegetables, cereals, and meat were eaten in large quantity. The Aryan also drank the Aryans also drank, drank intoxicating drinks such as shura and madhu. There was another very special drink called soma, which was drunk only during a religious ceremony, as it was difficult to prepare. The Aryans were fond of life and lived well and were a cheerful people. Religion: The Aryan worshipped many gods, the forces of nature such as the sun, the stars, the winds, the moon, the earth, the sky, trees, rivers, and mountains all became gods and goddesses. Thus Peter was the sky god, Indra was the god of rain, storm and war, Surya was the sun god, Agni was the god of fire, Usha was the god of the dawn. The gods were supposed to have human form. But they were superhuman beings who were very powerful and to be feared. It was believed that the gods were generally kind to men and women, but when they were annoyed, their anger was terrible, and then they would have to be propitiated. Indra was the favorite god because he was strong and he could strike down the demons and the enemies of the Aryans. The Aryans believed that the gods could be pleased by the religious sacrifices conducted by the priests. Great preparations were made for such a sacrifice. Great preparations was made for such a sacrifice. Altars were built, magical designs were painted on them, and animals were sacrificed to the chanting by of hymns by the priests. By the priests, grains, cattle, and clothes were given to the priests, and Shoma was drank. The priest, sorry, grain, cattle, and clothes were given to the priests, and Shoma was drank. Sorry, the priests prayed to the god to hear the requests of the people, and the people believed that the gods had heard them and would grant them their wishes. Sorry, the pe- the priests prayed to the god to hear the requests of the people, and the people believed that the gods had heard them and would grant them their wishes. The priests became the messengers between the gods and men, and so were naturally important. But not all the people were satisfied with the religion of sacrifices. They had other questions to ask. They wanted to know how the world was created, how the world was created, who were the gods who made man, and so on. These philosophers wandered away from the villages and to the quiet places of the forest, trying to find answers to their questions and to hold discussions amongst them. Sorry, but not all the people were satisfied with the religion of sacrifices. They had other questions to ask. They wanted to know how the world. Sorry, they wanted to know how the world was created. They wanted to know how the world was created. Who were the gods who made man, and so on. These philosophers wandered away from the villages into the quiet places of the forest, trying to find answers to their questions and to hold discussions amongst themselves. Their ideas were memorized by their pupils and were later recorded in writing. These can these we can read today in the Upanishads. Sorry, this we can read it today in the today we can read this in the Upanishads, which are a part of the Vedas. These teachers are called rishis. The Aryans fought with the people already living in India, defeated them. The Aryans called these people the Siouxes. Aryan society was divided into three classes: warriors, priests, and craftsmen and cultivators. The Siouxes became Shudras. The Siouxes became Shudras, another class. In course of time, the priests. In course of time, the priests attained the highest position. The use of iron, which the Aryans. The Siouxes became Sudraj, another class. In course of time, the priests attained the highest position. The use of iron, which the Aryans learned, was a great evidence. In addition, the horse was a very useful animal. Apart from agriculture, metal work, carpentry, tanning, weaving, spinning were the main occupations in the villages. The Aryans were fond of ornaments, chariot racing, dancing, and gambling were the amusements. The Aryans ate meat and drank intoxic. The Aryans ate meat and drank intoxicating drinks. The Aryans worshipped many gods. The gods had to be pleased through religious sacrifices. Some people were not satisfied with the sacrifices, and their ideas are found in the Upanishads. धन्यवाद. Thank you so much.